Our Old Testament reading this morning is found in Proverbs, chapter 25, verses 6 and 7. Don't demand an audience with the king or push for a place among the great. It's better to wait for an invitation to the head table than to be sent away in public disgrace. Our gospel reading is found in Luke chapter 14, verse 1, and then verses 7 through 14. One Sabbath day, Jesus went to eat dinner in the home of a leader of the Pharisees, and the people were watching him closely. When Jesus noticed that all who had come to the dinner were trying to sit in the seats of honor near the head of the table, he gave them this advice. When you are invited to a wedding feast, don't sit in the seat of honor. What if someone who is more distinguished than you has also been invited? The host will come and say, "Give this person your seat." Then you will be embarrassed, and you will have to take whatever seat is left at the foot of the table. Instead, take the lowest place at the foot of the table. Then when your host sees you, he will come and say, "Friend, you have a better place. We have a better place for you." Then you will be honored in front of all the other guests. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Then he turned to his host. "When you put on a luncheon banquet," he said, "don't invite your friends, brothers, relatives, and rich neighbors, for they will invite you back, and that will be your only reward. Instead, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. Then, at the resurrection of the righteous, God will reward you for inviting those who could not repay you." May the Lord bless the reading of his word. So our reading this morning takes place on a Sabbath again. Last week we talked about Jesus healing on the Sabbath. And in fact, the portion of the passage that we didn't read this morning, between verses 1 and 7, so verses 2 to 6, guess what Jesus is doing? He's healing someone on the Sabbath. And in fact, it's at the dinner that he's gone to, and it's a man with palsy. And according to my research, what that means is an illness that had to do with, I have it in my notes, edema. It's a type of, in those days it would have included bloating, and notably, it involved a great thirst, and no matter how much the person drank, it only made things worse. Interestingly enough, contemporary Greek writers of the time used that illness, that they called palsy, as a metaphor for greed, because they said, like that disease, greed was a similar disease because it can't be healed by something that comes from the outside, i.e. The thirst that a person with that disease had couldn't be cured by drinking more, and in the same way, greed couldn't be cured by having more. In fact, the more you drank or the more you had, the worse it got. So with greed, the more you would acquire, the more greedy you became, was what the philosophers and Greek teachers were trying to say in that. So it's interesting to note, and you should pay attention to the fact that what we missed was a bit of a story that Luke has included to make sure that the following portion of this whole dinner story is interpreted in a particular way. So, Jesus has been invited to eat the dinner of a leader of the Pharisees. And everybody's watching him closely. And that's a setup for the healing that takes place on the Sabbath. And this time, instead of just going ahead and healing him, he asks all of the leaders at the tables. And this is something you should understand, is that a leader of the Pharisees wouldn't... Okay, I have to back up a second. The type of meal that's happening here, it's not just a Sunday afternoon meal where you just invite all your friends or whoever's around or things like that. Excuse me. The historians and scholars believe that when we encounter meals like this, and especially in places like people like the Pharisees and stuff, where Jesus is invited as a special guest, this is what's often called in Greek culture a symposium type of meal. And the Jewish people, especially the ones who had a little more wealth or honor or status, adopted the same kind of pattern that the Greeks and the Romans had of having this meal where you invite honored guests and excuse me, you get an idea of what those honored guests are at the end of the passage when Jesus says, don't invite these people. Well, he's naming the kind of people that were invited and the kind of people that are sitting around at the tables while Jesus is talking. So to a symposium or a special dinner, Jesus calls it a banquet, of this nature, you invite people of a similar standing to yourself. Sometimes you might invite people who had a higher standing because if they come, if you believe that they will come, that raises your standard up, and all of your other friends who are of equal standing are very impressed by the fact that you could get this important person to come to your meal. This may be why Jesus is here. Not necessarily that he is more important or whether or not they recognize a higher honor, but in Luke's gospel, there is this growth in Jesus' honor. The interactions that he has with other people, the crowds, the way the stories are structured, if you understand the honor society that Jesus lives in, you can see that Luke is drawing this image of Jesus' ever-increasing honor. And you can see that that's part of the reason why there's an ever-increasing tension between him and first the Pharisees, who consider themselves at least to be equals and are seeing themselves being surpassed by this upstart from backwater Galilee, who doesn't have their credentials of teaching, but has a much better credential of miracles, which is why they're jealous. But then he begins to climb above the leaders in Jerusalem, the priests and the high priests and the other fancy leaders in the city that is the center of their worship and the center of their religious culture and everything else. And so in Luke's gospel, this is what's happening. But back to our story. Jesus is probably invited partly because of his growing honor, but also because he does things like heal people, right? You know, in the middle of a meal, or he says things that are controversial. And if nothing else, that's entertaining, right? So what this does is it sort of gives the elite a sort of a box seat to Jesus' traveling roadshow, right? You know, they get to come, sit for a meal, and see this man up close. And they know that the riffraff has to, you know, gather in big crowds out in fields and things, and they might never get to even really hear him all that closely because they're at the back of the crowd or whatever. But they're going to get a front row seat. So this works really well for the man who's putting on the meal, right? Because this brings him honor because he's providing something to his friends. But the kind of people that he invites are going to be pretty much people of the same kind of standing. They're going to be people with honor and stuff. He has enough means to provide a meal for a group of people. And this could be anything from 9 or 10 or 12 people up to, who knows, we get no inclination here. But they're watching Jesus, and we'll come back to their arrangement and stuff in a minute. So then we jump forward after the healing. Oh, I'm sorry. Jesus has said to all these leaders, now I know why I went off on that tangent. Jesus said on these to the leaders when he was about to do the healing, he says, is it okay to heal on the Sabbath, or should you leave the person ill? Is it better to heal or to cause harm, to do good or to do harm? And of course, it's a trick question. None of them answered it. And he asks it 2 or 3 times, and nobody's willing to answer it. So then he goes ahead and takes the man aside and heals him. So after that episode, we catch up with Jesus, and he says, when we see Jesus notices all that had come to the dinner. So they were watching him, and he's watching them. And they were trying to sit in the seats of honor near the head of the table. And then he gives them the advice that we read. But I want to first show you this little diagram, and I don't know if you can read those words, but they're in Latin anyway, or Greek, so I don't know which one, but it doesn't necessarily help. But this is to give you an idea of what a small one of these meals would have looked like. The table at the top there, and it's labeled in medio, that would have been the head table. And the most honored guest would be in the center of that, and they'd be lying. That's why they're showing them in angles. So these aren't actually tables. The only table is the one in the middle that says mensa, and that would be a low table. Traditionally, these are mats or couches, and people are laying down on these couches, resting on their elbow and eating with one hand, right? And so the fellow in the middle is the highest honored position, and then to either side are the next honored positions, and then the table to your right, that'd be the guy at the head table's left, is the next honored table. And then it goes the same kind of way. And then the third table there is the least honored. In the text that explains this stuff, it said that the least or the last table would have the host and his family. That would be a smaller kind of gathering. In a larger gathering, there'd be more tables or longer benches or couches or mats. There'd be more people. They'd line them up a little differently. And we get the impression that in the kind of gathering that we're reading about here, the leader or the host is probably at the head table or nearby. But it's not important. What's important is to understand that in that culture, and especially in this activity, this special kind of meal, where you sit, and they're actually not sitting, they lay down, but where you recline at table is, thank you, is very important because it designates your honor, your status. So if I get to sit a little higher in the ranking, a little closer to the head table, than I might actually warrant, I'm going to gain a little extra honor, right? But that's a bit of a gamble, right? Both our proverb this morning and Jesus' own words warn that if you go too high, the person who's putting on the meal might come and say, no, that place is saved. I'm sorry, that's reserved. You're going to have to go find another spot. Now, two things could happen. They could say, well, that spot over there is yours, and it's going to be lower anyway, so you're going to be embarrassed one way or the other. But another thing that Jesus says could happen is you're going to get up, and there are unassigned spaces, and the only ones that are left are at the bottom, right? At the end of the table, foot of the table, he says, which is translating it into language we would understand, the same idea. The further from the head, further from the action, further from the center of honor is what's going to happen, right? So what is happening when these guys are coming in and looking for the best places is there must be unassigned seating, and it's expected that everybody's supposed to, and this is part of what goes on in cultures like this one, honor cultures, and where people are vying for honor and stuff, and there's sort of a competition. It takes place even in places and times like this. At this meal, it's actually a bit of a setup for people to come and sort of play this game of one-upmanship or of who gets to sit in the best spot, right? But Jesus watches this and he gives this advice. He says, when you're invited, don't sit at the seat of honor. What if someone who is more distinguished than you has also been invited? You know? And just like I said, the host is going to come and tell you to give your person the seat away, and you'll be embarrassed, and you'll have to take whatever seat is left at the foot of the table, right? That's not going to be a very good thing to happen, is it? Yeah, okay. I haven't been following my notes, and it doesn't do any good to go back to them if you haven't been following them. So, what I wanted to sort of help us to center on this morning as we look at this passage is that for this morning I want to talk a little bit more about the table, right? So for these people, this experience is one, it's called antagonistic. Or, no, I think I got that wrong. I think it's agonistic. And actually that's more accurate to the way it would feel, especially for someone like me. I don't know. Have you ever been to banquets like that where the seating's not it's not assigned seating, and you go to a banquet, a wedding, or big church events are like this often, and you go and you're never quite sure where to sit, right? Because you'd like to sit with somebody you know, or you're gonna have a chat with, or whatever. You might, if there's an event where there's something to see or hear, you want to sit where you can hear it, but you don't want to look too forward or whatever it is. But if you stand around trying to figure it out too long, you end up in the back by the kitchen, or with your back to the stage, or it's an awkward situation, right? But in this culture, it's a lot more than awkward. This is important stuff to these guests anyway. The people that Jesus tells his host that he should invite at the end of the story, they probably would be just happy to have food, right? But to these guests, it's important where they get to sit. It's important how they sort out who gets the most honor. And it isn't just where you end up, it's the sorting it out, right? It's a little game of second guessing who thinks who's better than the other guy. Excuse me. And it doesn't make for a very friendly table. And what's happening is something that should be about fellowship, something that should be in the image of, reclining at table. In other parts of the Bible, we read where this image or this imagery of meals and things is used as a wonderful image or idea of fellowship, a wonderful idea of sort of bringing people together and of God's blessings. And that's what the table's supposed to be, is a celebration of God's blessing. But what's happening at this dinner is a competition. It's just another extension of what goes on throughout their daily lives of trying to figure out who can be the best at whatever. Ironically, I think in some ways, they're actually not doing a very good job of keeping the Sabbath, because they've taken their same workaday world into this Sabbath meal where they should be, relaxing. So there it is. Take the lowest place, and this is not out of the ordinary from Jesus' teaching, right? The first shall be last, the last shall be first. Jesus is, you may have heard, or you will hear if you ever, a common phrase referring to Jesus' kingdom teaching is the upside down kingdom, right? Where the people on the top are expected to be on the bottom and vice versa, right? If you want to be a leader in Jesus' kingdom, he says, be a servant. If you want to be great, be like a child. If he just uses all this imagery to say that reverse your expectations. Don't behave the way the world behaves. Don't behave the way we just naturally want to behave sometimes, right? And Jesus does things like he eats with women. He goes to a big meal and somehow or another he's sitting with the women. And in his culture, that's, next to the servants, right? And he's constantly doing things like that, right? He goes to this meal and people are watching him. The important people are watching him. And somewhere in the background, this guy goes by with palsy, and Jesus sees that first. It does say he watches the other guys, but he sees the person in need first. Like last week, he goes to the synagogue and he reads, and the first thing he sees is when he's done doing the reading from the scriptures and he's done doing his teaching, he sees a woman who's crippled, and he takes pity on her and he has compassion. And that's the upside down kingdom idea. And so here, this shouldn't come as any surprise to us. It might have come as a big surprise, or at least it's a reminder to the audience, Jesus' audience at the dinner, that you invited a weird person to come and talk to you, and he's going to tell you weird things, right? Don't invite, don't take the high places. Take the low places, and then you'll be exalted. Does that really happen in life? Is that how life works? It isn't most of the time, really. Not in my experience. In my experience, most of the time, if you go and you take the lowest place, most people are happy to let you stay there. If you were a special invited guest, they might come and do exactly what Jesus describes in his story. And in Jesus' culture, they probably would be more inclined because there's this honor thing going on and there's this game being played. In our culture, that's not necessarily how it works. The principle is at work in some ways. The principle that, as another proverb says, pride goes before the fall, right? So the principle is definitely true. If we try to exalt ourselves too much, we're going to run the risk of falling all the way down, right? That's what happens to public figures who pump themselves up too much, and then people find out they have clay feet and they get totally disgraced because they're public figures and everybody was watching them, and so now we have fun destroying them, right? That's the way our world works. But again, when Jesus is telling us to do things and when he's teaching people to do things, he isn't teaching us about how the real world works most of the time. He's teaching us about the kingdom that he has come to bring. He's describing the way he wants his followers to live. He's describing the way that the community that he wants to create. This is the description of the church that should be coming after his resurrection. Then he goes to his host and he says, when you do something like this, don't invite your friends, your brothers, your relatives, your rich neighbors. So friends in this culture are equals, business partners, those kinds of people, right? People you'll do business with, people you trust, and people who trust you. They're seen as equals. If you invite a friend to a meal like this, he's considered a friend and an equal because he's invited. Where he sits will depend on what the ranking amongst all of our equals who aren't exactly equal, right? Relatives, presumably if I have means, then my relatives have means, right? So if I own property and I can invite them, they can probably invite me. Rich neighbors, again, rich neighbors might be people I don't necessarily have dealings with, but I know that they also have land and the ability to invite me back to a nice meal. So if I throw on a big meal and I invite them, they're honor bound to return the favor. It's interesting to note that this really does play out in Jesus' culture, where people will have to refuse invitations because they know they can't reciprocate, right? So that might happen to relatives or people like that, right? Or maybe I have a friend, someone of equal honor standing, but he's on hard times because his crops didn't do well or something bad happened, and he just can't reciprocate, so he'll have to send his regrets. Because if he comes and doesn't reciprocate, he loses honor, and I gain it. That's the way that society works. But instead of inviting any of those people, because being re-invited is its own reward, you invite poor, crippled, lame, and blind people. Well, these people all live on the street most of the time, right? They don't have homes, they don't have jobs, they're not capable. So these are poor people. These are people who absolutely are not going to be able to invite you to a meal, right? And Jesus is saying, when you do that, at the resurrection of the righteous, God will reward you for inviting those who could not repay you. So Jesus is once again laying the groundwork for a generous, for generosity, for sharing of the things that we've been blessed with people who are less fortunate. He's setting the groundwork for the kingdom that he's come to bring, and that his church, his followers, are supposed to live into. Now, often these passages are used to teach primarily about pride, or or the last section can be just about generosity and charity and whatnot. But as I was preparing and realizing that this was going to be a communion Sunday, the Spirit moved me to think of this passage in terms of the table. And I alluded to this a little early at the beginning of what I was talking about, in that we make a mistake if when we come to communion, we forget that this is a table, that this represents sharing food, that this represents the fellowship that takes place at a meal. We call it a meal. We call it the table. We use all kinds of language in our services and in the ways in which we talk about the communion that evoke the image of the meal, because for 2,000 years, that's what it's been for the church. That's what it is for followers of Jesus. It's a meal, but it's a very special meal, right? It's one in which Christ says he serves himself to us. And so in some traditions, the belief is that the juice or the wine actually becomes Christ's blood, the bread becomes Christ's body, just as Christ said, this is my blood and this is my body. And in other traditions, we believe, in our tradition, we don't believe that the elements change from what they are, but that Christ is somehow miraculously present in those elements and in our activity at the table. In other Christian traditions, the table is nothing more than a memorial. The bread and the juice or wine are just symbols that remind us of what Jesus has done for us. We all call ourselves Christians, and we all come to the table. But the table needs to be more than just a tradition and more than just a religious rite or activity. Even if we see it as sacred, or even if we see it as spiritual, and even if we believe that something miraculous is happening at the table, I invite you to try to remember that it isn't just a religious thing. Jesus chose the center point of all of our lives together to make this religious thing. He chose the table. It's where we meet. It's where we talk and discuss. It's where we share food. It's where we share fellowship. It's where we are the most connected to each other. As families, and there's lots of research that tells us that families that sit down to at least one meal a day with each other are closer and healthier, and the children grow up with a more stable foundation than families that don't do that. The meal is an important part of our culture. And one of the things that we're losing, I think, in our Western culture is sight of that to some degree. Now, I say that knowing that there are a lot of younger people that are reconnecting with that. There are a lot of people that get how important the meal is. They get how important gathering around the table is. And you'll see that in a lot of places. It can't be forgotten completely because it's so much a part of who we are. And so this morning, if you came in and you saw the communion table laid out in a different way than normal and you wondered what's Pastor Cameron up to again, that's part of what it's about. I wanted to create something that told us that what we're doing this morning is bigger than just coming and getting a little piece of bread and a little bit of juice and I've done my deed for the month and communion is done. When you come to this table, I want you to think about the table that Jesus has created for us, the table that Jesus has laid for us. And that table is represented in his words to that leader. Invite the blind and the poor and the crippled. It's an open table. Jesus wants everyone at his table. Never, ever forget that. Jesus wants everyone at his table. That's our job, isn't it? To try to bring people to his table. So, in some traditions, the communion table is closed. That means if you haven't been baptized, or if you aren't a member, or lots of different reasons, you cannot have communion in that church. At some churches, the communion table is not necessarily closed, but the word that was used years ago was fenced. Sometimes that's used for closed as well, but meaning that you at least have to be baptized, or there are certain requirements, or even members of that church are expected to not come to the table if they've got this sin in their lives or some other thing. And I've had people ask me about, should we be letting people come to the table who we know are living an unconfessed sin, or living in a manner that we don't necessarily think is the proper Christian lifestyle. My answer has been pretty easy because it's what the church that I've been ordained in teaches, and that is, it's an open table. It's not my job, it's not our job to distinguish who is worthy. The truth is none of us are worthy, right? We don't come to Christ's table out of worthiness. We come to Christ's table because of his grace, his generosity, his love for us. That's what the table's about, right? When you get invited to a grand meal for free, and there's no expectations of return, that's generosity. That's love. When your mother, your brother, your sister, your friend invites you over for a meal and they put an extra effort into making something that you enjoy or to making something special for that meal, they're showing love, right? Ask anybody who enjoys baking or cooking or making good food, and they'll tell you that part of it's an expression of love. Jesus chose the table as an expression of his love to us. That's what this is about, right? So, in our church, it's an open table. And you've heard me every month, I guess, say, if you believe or if you want to believe, come to this table, right? That's because in the Free Methodist Church, we believe, that communion is an act of, or a means of grace. What we mean by that is that it's an opportunity for Christ's miraculous grace to enter into our lives and do something special. Christ can minister to us and heal us, or help us to grow, or help us to become better than we are, or to just draw us closer to himself. We believe communion is an opportunity for that kind of miraculous grace in our lives. And God shows grace to us all throughout our lives. We believe that God's grace is shed out throughout our lives everywhere and in everything we do. But we also believe that things like the communion are special types of grace, special channel where God can really do something amazing or unexpected in our lives. Again, generosity. So when we invite people to the table in our church, we say, anyone who wants to believe. And that includes people who are uncertain. That includes people who just long for something that they see or sense at the table. Does it bother me that they don't understand? You know what? No. I struggled with it through the years, but not so much anymore. This is Jesus' table. And if anyone comes to this table, he will deal with them in the way that they need to be dealt with. I believe that so strongly. We need to believe that when we come to this table. We need to believe this isn't about us. This isn't something we're giving each other. This is something Jesus is giving us. We prepare it, our hands are involved because we are Jesus' hands. But once it's set, Jesus takes over. He's the host here. And so anyone can come to this table. And if they need to be corrected, then God will do that. If all they need today is to be loved, Jesus will do that too. Maybe healing needs to begin. Spiritual, mental, emotional, physical. Jesus does that. That's what our table is for. Jesus, as we come this morning to your table, I pray that you will bring us together in a fellowship that knows no boundaries, an open fellowship, a loving fellowship that is generous with each other and generous with our own hearts and our own souls. Dear Jesus, I do believe that if we don't open ourselves up to each other, we can't truly be open to you. I believe that if you are pouring your love and your grace into us, it opens us up to each other. I pray that you do that through our table, through your table, and our communion this morning that we share because of you. In Jesus' precious name.